Trump begs for wheat. In a moment that would be replayed endlessly on news channels, President Trump, once so confident in his America First approach, now found himself pleading for a basic commodity: wheat. The world watched as the leader of the free world faced a crisis he never anticipated, his administration scrambling for solutions as the nation's food security was suddenly at risk. Carney's answer: freezes global supply chains. Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, responded with a move that sent shockwaves through the global economy. Ports ground to a halt, warehouses emptied, and the intricate web of international shipping was thrown into chaos. The ripple effects were immediate, with businesses and consumers alike feeling the pinch as goods stopped flowing. This was the headline that stunned the world on January 22, 2026. Newsrooms buzzed with urgency as anchors broke the story, and social media exploded with speculation and fear. The world's attention was riveted on North America as the implications of this trade war became clear. The United States, long the world's economic titan, was suddenly on the defensive, undone by its closest ally. Wall Street trembled, and the mood in Washington shifted from confidence to crisis. For the first time in generations, America's dominance was being openly challenged, not by a distant rival, but by a neighbor and friend. The crisis began quietly, with a signing ceremony in Beijing. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Chinese President Xi Jinping finalizing a historic trade agreement. Cameras flashed as the two leaders smiled, but behind the diplomatic pleasantries was a seismic shift in global alliances. This deal, months in the making, would alter the balance of power for years to come. This deal, born of desperation and strategy, sent shockwaves through North American trade. For decades, the US-Canada relationship was the gold standard, built on shared values and deeply intertwined economies. Factories, farms, and families on both sides of the border had prospered under this partnership, making the sudden rupture all the more shocking. But Trump's America First policies, tariffs, diplomatic freezes, pushed Canada to the brink. Feeling cornered, Canada looked east. The Beijing Agreement was a direct challenge to a century of economic integration. The border, once a symbol of friendship, now became a line of division as Canada charted a new course with China. Global markets panicked. Wheat futures soared, not from drought, but from a pen stroke in China. Automakers in Detroit and Windsor scrambled as supply chains faced collapse. The uncertainty sent shockwaves through every sector, from agriculture to manufacturing, as companies struggled to adapt to the new reality. The USMCA, the backbone of continental trade, was suddenly in jeopardy. This was more than a trade dispute. It was a realignment of global power. Tense meetings behind closed doors could not hide the fact that the old rules no longer applied, and leaders across North America were forced to reconsider their strategies. The Canada-China deal proved even America's closest partners could walk away. China was ready to offer alternatives, and Canada took the gamble. The rules of the game had changed overnight. New trade routes were being drawn, and old alliances were being tested as never before. The world was watching a new chapter in economic history unfold. As leaders and citizens alike tried to make sense of the upheaval, one thing was clear: the global order was shifting, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. To truly grasp the magnitude of the crisis, you must first understand the extraordinary depth of US-Canada economic ties. For decades, these two nations have been more than just neighbors. They have been partners, allies, and economic lifelines for one another. For generations, their economies functioned almost seamlessly as one. American automakers depended on Canadian parts to keep their assembly lines moving, while Canadian farmers supplied wheat, canola, and other crops to feed American families. Every day, thousands of trucks crossed the border, carrying goods that fueled both nations' prosperity. Landmark agreements like NAFTA and later USMCA didn't just facilitate trade. They created a sense of stability and shared destiny. These deals helped both countries weather global economic storms and foster decades of growth and cooperation. But under Trump's second term, that hard-won stability began to unravel. Political rhetoric grew sharper, and trust between the two governments started to erode. Washington imposed harsh tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and lumber, treating Canada less like a trusted ally and more like a direct competitor. The impact was immediate. Factories slowed, jobs were lost, and uncertainty spread across industries. Ottawa's pleas for relief were ignored. Negotiations were met with ultimatums and threats. The breaking point came with agriculture, a sector at the heart of Canada's economy. Trump's tariffs on Canadian wheat and canola devastated rural communities. Grain piled up in silos, unsold and unwanted, while farm incomes plummeted. The sense of betrayal ran deep. Prime Minister Carney faced a national crisis unlike any in recent memory. The very foundation of Canada's economic security was at risk. Canada's options were grim: capitulate to U.S. demands, retaliate with their own tariffs, or seek out entirely new trading partners. Each path carried enormous risks. The unthinkable, pivoting to China, suddenly became not just possible, but pragmatic. With the U.S. market closing, Canada had to look elsewhere for survival. As Washington froze Canada out, Beijing emerged as the obvious, if complicated, alternative. The world watched as old alliances faltered and new ones formed. China's insatiable demand for agricultural products, combined with its own tensions with the U.S., made it a natural, though challenging, partner for Canada. New trade deals were signed, and Canadian goods began flowing east. The stage was set for a dramatic shift away from North America. Trade routes that had defined a continent for a century were being redrawn in real time. The trust and cooperation built over a century was evaporating, replaced by uncertainty and suspicion. The partnership that once seemed unbreakable was now in tatters. Canada's pivot to Asia was not a choice, but a survival move. A last-ditch effort to protect its economy and its people from the fallout of a fractured alliance. The North American partnership, once the envy of the world, was unraveling before everyone's eyes, leaving both nations to face an uncertain future. The Beijing signing ceremony was pure political theater. Prime Minister Carney and President Xi stood together, signaling a seismic shift. For China, it was a diplomatic coup, peeling away a key U.S. ally. The deal was sweeping, reorienting Canadian trade from the U.S. to China. Canada's supply chains would now run east-west, not north-south. Carney's message: Canada would no longer bow to U.S. pressure. The world watched, shocked, as the Western alliance fractured. The deal was a direct result of Trump's transactional foreign policy. For Canada, it was a lifeline for farmers and a vision for economic diversification. But it came with risks, closer ties to an authoritarian China. In 2026, the immediate threat from the U.S. outweighed long-term concerns. The handshake in Beijing was a gamble, but for Canada, it was the only move left. The Canada-China deal hinged on agriculture and autos. For Canadian farmers, it was salvation. China slashed tariffs on wheat and canola, opening a vast new market. Grain once bound for the U.S. now shipped to Shanghai. U.S. food producers, cut off from Canadian wheat, faced supply shocks and rising prices. American consumers felt it at the grocery store. On autos, Canada dropped tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Chinese EV makers gained a North American foothold, with plans for assembly plants in Ontario. Detroit's Big Three were rattled. Canada was now a competitor, not just a partner. The North American Auto Pact was upended. The fine print revealed a new reality. Canada had a powerful new alliance. The U.S. faced higher costs and stiffer competition. The trade landscape had shifted overnight. Canada was no longer just America's junior partner. The White House erupted. President Trump, furious, accused Carney of betrayal and selling out to China. His public response: angry posts, a fiery press conference, and threats of massive retaliation. Hardliners pushed for a 30% tariff on all Canadian goods and even sealing the border. Moderates warned this would devastate U.S. industries and spark inflation. But Trump sided with the hardliners, threatening to withdraw from the USMCA if Canada didn't back down. The message: defy Washington, pay the price. The administration's response was not negotiation, it was economic war. Trump bet the U.S. could withstand the fallout and Canada would buckle. The stakes, the entire framework of North American trade. The world braced for the consequences. The U.S.-Canada relationship had never been so strained. The trade war was now official. Trump's threat to quit the USMCA sent shockwaves across the continent. The agreement governed over $1 trillion in annual trade. Its collapse would plunge North American commerce into chaos. Investment froze. Companies halted expansion, fearing new tariffs. Intricate supply chains, built for seamless cross-border flow, faced disaster. Automakers scrambled to prepare for 30% tariffs on every component. Mexico, deeply tied to the U.S. market, watched in alarm and tried to mediate. But this was now about sovereignty and pride, not just trade. The USMCA, meant to secure North America's future, was on life support. Businesses faced paralyzing uncertainty. The rules that built a continent's prosperity were unraveling. The economic backbone of North America was at risk. The fallout hit ordinary people hardest. Canadian infrastructure built for north-south trade buckled under the shift to China. Railcars and ports were overwhelmed. Grain shipments stalled. In the US, factories lost access to Canadian wheat, forcing costly changes and price hikes. Food prices rose for American consumers. The auto industry was paralyzed. Canadian plants lost orders. US plants halted for lack of parts. Layoffs hit both sides of the border. The cycle of disruption and retaliation bred fear and uncertainty. Prices rose not from scarcity, but from chaos. Workers lost jobs over politics, not productivity. Decades of integration were undone in weeks. The human cost of the trade war was undeniable. The promise of a stable North American market was shattered. The US-Canada crisis sent a clear message. American economic dominance was no longer guaranteed. Canada's pivot to China was dramatic, but others followed. Mexico accelerated trade talks with Europe and South America to reduce US dependence. Europe, wary of US unpredictability, pushed for strategic autonomy and new trade deals. Asian allies like Japan and South Korea questioned US reliability, strengthening regional pacts that excluded America. China's appeal as a trade partner grew. The world's trade map was redrawn, no longer US-centric but fragmented and multipolar. New corridors emerged, Canada to China, Mexico to Europe, Brazil to India. This wasn't a more efficient system, it was born of mistrust and friction. The breakdown of US-Canada ties accelerated a global shift away from integration. Competing economic blocs replaced old alliances. The world was entering a new era of trade rivalry. As the dust settled, the greatest casualty was trust. What once seemed unbreakable now felt fragile, as if a single misstep could shatter it all over again. The US-Canada relationship, built on decades of mutual prosperity and cooperation, was suddenly shattered, leaving both nations to question what had gone wrong. Aggressive tariffs and ultimatums from Washington left deep wounds, economic pain that rippled through communities, businesses, and families on both sides of the border. Canada's pivot to China was a defensive move, proof that trust was gone, and a signal to the world that old alliances could no longer be taken for granted. Even if tariffs were lifted tomorrow, the memory of this crisis would linger for years. The scars would not heal quickly, if at all. Companies would now factor political risk into every cross-border investment, weighing uncertainty where there was once only opportunity. The seamless integration of the past was likely gone for good, replaced by caution and hesitation that would slow progress for years to come. America's willingness to sacrifice stability for short-term gain had global consequences, sending shockwaves through international markets and alliances. The world was already moving on, signing new deals without Washington, forging fresh partnerships that left the US on the sidelines. Can the relationship be repaired? Only with time, respect, and a return to shared interests. It will take patience, humility, and a willingness to listen. But as of January 22, 2026, the continent stood divided, its people separated by more than just lines on a map. The North American model was now a cautionary tale, a warning to others about the fragility of trust and the high cost of division. A century of friendship had unraveled in a matter of weeks, leaving a legacy of regret and a question that still hangs in the air. Can Humpty Dumpty ever be put together again?